Hello and welcome to Hay Festival. It's lovely to see you here this afternoon. We are in for a huge treat. We're here to, I think really what we're doing to be doing is overhearing a conversation with two very passionate people on the subject of children and reading. Now, many of you may have heard bits of them on the radio, but we are going to have the benefit of a whole hour of this conversation. So I won't say much, I promise you, but I will hand over to them. So I'm going to introduce them. We're going to start with a small film, and then we're going to have the programme, and there will be, the conversation, and then there will be time for some questions at the end. So, Frank Cottrell-Boyce, current Children's Laureate, author of this book most recently, but author of many books before that, winner of the Carnegie Medal, the UK's most distinguished children's book prize for millions, winner of the Guardian Children's Books Prize for, I think, his best book, The Unforgotten Coat, but he perhaps wouldn't agree with me on that, but you can always argue these things. And, of course, perhaps most famous for having written the opening ceremony of the 2012 UK Olympics, which was quite staggering, if you remember, because it was really all about children's books, and that doesn't happen very often. So, Frank, we owe a huge debt of gratitude to you for that. He is also this week the man behind Reading Rights, which is the campaign, I think is the best way to call it. It is a book. It's come out of Book Trust, who are the home of the UK Children's Laureate, but it is a statement, an incredibly important statement about reading and children at the moment. And I do urge all of you to get hold of this if you can and take a look at it, because it's a really important roadmap for the future. And we also have Sam Wass, Professor of Neuroscience and Director of the Institute of Science for Science of Early Years at the University of East London, and the author of this book. I didn't know I wouldn't have a table. That book, Take Action on Distraction. And Sam is going to show us, we're going to look at a clip of some of the work Sam's done on research into children's brains, which informs his views of children and reading, and that's going to be the sort of starting point and the finishing point of our conversation. So, if we could have the small clip, thank you very much. Where's the screen?
The scan's underway, so what am I looking at here, Sam?
So what we're looking at is this visualization that we've come up with, basically, of how synchronized Ashley's and Mia's brain rhythms are. So when they're further apart, then they're less synchronized, there's less similarity between the rhythms. When they're closer together, they're firing at the same time. And what we can see is that since Ashley's been reading to Mia, we get much more of these coming together of the different brains. Yeah. And that's showing that Ashley is creating brain rhythms in her own brain through her reading, and Mia's brain is tracking into these rhythms, so they're both sharing the same rhythms at the same time.
This is like two brains dancing.
Yeah, it's lovely to watch.
Two brains learning to dance.
And what's lovely about this is we're just looking at these very fast brain rhythms, but we also know that in Mia's and Ashley's bodies, in Ashley's breathing patterns, in her heart rate, in her movement, in her facial expressions, there are all these other rhythms, and it's exactly the same thing happening. So we've shown in other studies that exactly the same thing happens, that you get these synchronies at all of these different levels at the same time. It's important for three different areas, really. So one, it's important for language perception. Yeah. So there's a lot of good reasons that this slowing down of her brain rhythms, tuning in, helps Mia to learn language. Yeah. Secondly, it's important for relaxation, because this slowing down of our rhythms, letting a young child to tune into an adult rhythms helps them to be calmer, because we're naturally calmer than children. But thirdly, it's important for relationship building. So there's really good evidence that being in the same state at the same time as someone, sharing rhythms with someone, helps build mutual understanding and empathy.
This was a very big moment in your work you'd been doing for some time around children reading.
Yeah, first of all, because I hadn't realised until I watched that just how very bored I am. I'd hidden it from myself, but not from you. But So when I became laureate, I kind of felt that I wanted to talk about early years because I just think that's where the biggest difference is made and that's where we're losing stuff. But I had what I assume everybody had, which is, well, it was partly because I'd been going to schools where I'd been talking to teachers who were talking about children who were arriving at school who'd never encountered a book and never been read to. So they didn't know how to, it was an alien piece of tech. They didn't know, they would try and swipe pages or try and make the pictures bigger by doing this, or just did not know how to work a book, which was a huge educational disadvantage. But as a dad, I also thought about what a gap in happiness that was. Because my own personal happiest memories were of reading to my kids and being read to, and so on and all that. So I had that kind of gut feeling, that hunch. But it wasn't until I went to Sam's lab that I saw the profundity of that something is going on when you read to a very little baby that is far more than an educational thing or far more than just a pleasant thing. And I think Sam should talk us through what that is. But to me, it was kind of absolutely a revelation that this isn't something that's pleasurable or nice or an advantage. There's something going on in that moment when someone who loves a baby is sharing, whether it's a story or a lullaby or whatever, that moment, something really fundamental and essential is happening.
Sam?
Yeah, so I think maybe the best place to start from what we were talking about is a different place to what we were talking about where we were talking in the film. It's about this idea that our brains are fundamentally prediction machines. So every single word that is coming out of my mouth as you're listening, your brain is using your prior knowledge of language to work out what I'm going to say next. So if I suddenly cabbage, then say something unexpected in the context, then all of your brains will have had a different kind of signal to that word cabbage in that context compared to if I'd said, I spent yesterday going out to the vegetable garden to water the cabbage. Yeah? And we can tell from that your brains are generating what I'm going to say and guessing what I'm going to say. And we use that for language processing, so we use our prior knowledge of language to process language, but we also use it for all forms of our visual perception. So I use my kind of basic knowledge of what a face looks like to expect what I'm going to see when I look everywhere we go. So babies don't have any of this prior knowledge, yeah? And because of that, their perceptual systems function in a very, very different way. It's much more bottom-up, so everything is much more unexpected. Yeah? Their brains are very messy, very over-connected. So during the first few years of life, we go through this phase of called an over-proliferation of synapses. So we go through this big process where our kind of the neurons, the individual cells in our brain, kind of branch out and join up with one another. And round about between 2 and 5, we have a peak in the number of different synapses that we have in our brain. So brains are very messy and very jumbled and very over-connected. And they have much less kind of expectation according to which to kind of process stuff, but they're also much, much slower. So one other thing that they've shown that I think is really, really important for understanding just how differently babies experience the world is they did a thing, so the fastest that an adult can see is about 10 flickers per second. So that's most TV is kind of done at that speed. For a 50-month-old, the fastest that they can see is 1 flicker per second. And for a 6-month-old, it's something like 1 flicker every 5 seconds. So if you think, how often when you smile, in an everyday setting, that smile has normally been and gone in less than a second. So for a 50-month-old, they can't see that smile. Yeah, it's happened too fast for their kind of experience. So imagine your own perception of reality, and you press 10 times fast forward on it. Yeah, that's what the world feels like from a baby's point of view. So what's really kind of important for the start of this reading journey is just understanding how babies' subjective experience of the world is so different to how we experience it as adults. Yeah, and then starting to unpack, which is what we're going to be talking about why reading is such a fundamental process in kind of starting to get the first steps, extract the first steps of meaning from experience.
Yeah, this is why Peepo is such a great game to play with a baby, because it's like when you do that, they go, oh my God, he's gone. He literally has gone. Oh no, he's back. Oh my God. Whoa. And what, I mean, you talked to me very simply about it when we first met, that like being a baby is completely overwhelming. Yeah. A few days ago, you were an aquatic creature. Yeah. And now, it's oh my God, he's gone, and he's back, and there's wind, and there's my mum, and they've got processing things. Yeah. And then, but you were saying to me that, like, the story, I mean, let's focus in on the book, because this is about books, but that having one picture
Yeah.
to look at for a long time.
Yeah, yeah.
It really sort of slows everything down and makes
Yeah.
the world a little bit more navigable.
Yeah.
And the thing that you said to me, which I wish I'd known when the kids were babies, was that this is a scene where a baby can have some agency.
Yeah.
So when
yeah,
you read,
yeah.
and you know, babies have agency by throwing things on the floor and making you pick them up, or by screaming and crying. But that thing when you read into a baby and the baby goes back a page,
Yeah,
or turns it upside down, or bites, this is a baby kind of asserting itself in the world.
Yeah, yeah,
It's a really kind of fundamental
yeah.
building blocks of becoming a person.
Yeah. So there's about 5 things I want to pick up on that. Can I?
Yeah.
Is that okay? So yeah. So
He pays attention 25 times faster than you, so you're going to have to wait to catch
my
up.
memory, unfortunately, is like a
He's
goldfish.
ahead of the adult.
He's got a messy brain.
Very, yeah. So yeah, first thing back to the peepo. So a lot of our kind of interactions, we've just got another baby coming, and I'm, wind the bobbin up is gearing up in my brain because I know I'm going to be spending a lot of the next few months singing that. And all of these games with people. So it's not just about the surprise of where you've gone. It's they're starting to build that expectation of, and then something's going to happen. Yeah. So the repeated sequence is crucial. Yeah. It's why they seek out, these really simple repetitions of, banging a spoon on the table, that type of thing. So that's one of the reasons why a lot of the baby books are done with this. I went to the zoo to send me a pet. They sent me a giraffe. So they always have that same sequence of events that's happening and then something else. Yeah? And it's because of this. They need that repetition. They need that doing the same thing again and again and again in order to start to build those expectations of what's going to happen next. That happened. Yeah? And they need that repetition. And it's the same thing with reading books repeatedly. Yeah? So that's one of the other reasons why they seek out repetition. This is something I was presenting this to the Scottish librarians, and they were saying, this is really freaking me out, Sam, because it's hardwired into me to think I need to be encouraging children to try new books every time they come to me. And I was saying, no. When they seek out the repetition, it's really, really crucial. Their experience is very different. Their brains are this big, messy, jumbled mess, and they need that repetition to practice understanding things. Yeah? They don't understand things the first time, but the 10th time they do. So that's why you really, really need it. So that's kind of a couple of things to say on that.
And just thinking about that agency thing, like maybe in a way the very first thing that you encounter that isn't you is a story or a song. That's something that you're kind of consciously catching up with or manipulating.
Yeah.
But isn't it something that we all know from reading aloud to small children that you do go back? They love to have the same story again and again, but we didn't know that it had an actual neurological scientific explanation.
Yeah. So should
They
we
need it.
yeah, completely. And should we talk a little bit about rhythm then? 'Cause that's
Yeah. So that's another way of, so basically kind of rhythms happen at lots and lots of different time scales, all around us. Yeah? So our speech is rhythmic, my hand gestures are rhythmic, our breathing is rhythmic. There are lots and lots of different kind of rhythms happening at different time scales. And one of the ways in which we start to build expectations, so this idea of predictability, which I've been saying is really, really crucial for, helping to understand the world for the first time. One of the ways that we start to build that is by having these rhythmic patterns. Because rhythms, by definition, are predictable. The loud and soft voices, the loud and soft kind of fluctuations of my voice are rhythmic. And naturally, our brains are rhythmic. So if you wire me up to one of those nets that you saw as an adult, you can see this very strong pattern. It's about 7 cycles per second. We call it the alpha cycle, and it's very strong in adults. If you wire a baby's brain up to the same thing, you can see the rhythms, but they're slower, and they're also much, much more irregular. Yeah? So they're there, and then they go, because their brains are this big kind of jumbled mess that they can't hold that pattern of rhythmic firing for a long time. So there are times when they're there, times when they're not. So that's happening in their brain, and similar things are happening in their bodies. Yeah? So they have all of these different kind of body rhythms. We have these kind of our heart is. If you look at your heart rate, it's doing a sine wave, going faster and slower, kind of about once every 5 seconds, through to the daily rhythms. So 24-hour cycles. And babies have those rhythms, but they're much messier. Obviously, their sleep-wake cycles are faster, but they're also more irregular. So all of these things, so creating a rhythmic structure in the sub-second level of how our voice is getting louder and softer as we speak, through to the daily level of every night at bedtime I do exactly the same thing, and I read a book, and that's part of my tradition. All of these different rhythms at different scales are part of, we create a structure, and we know from research that we've been doing and other people are doing, that babies' brains and bodies track into this structure that we're creating. Yeah? And that's part of learning to extract meaning, but it's also, as we were saying in the video a little bit, it's also part of learning to relax. Yeah? So we can't be stable. We can never be in a flat state. Yeah? So the way that we achieve calm is stability through movement. Yeah? So as adults, we have this strong, stable cycle. Yeah? We're always moving, but we know where we're moving next, and we have these kinds of expectations. And that is how we achieve stability as biological organisms. So it's all of these rhythms, creating them for babies, which is really, really important to help them to make this transition from their messy, unpredictable world of being a baby through to kind of calmness.
And this was that thing on my very first visit to the lab that I took away that I thought was like, it was just one of the most beautiful things I'd ever seen, watching these two brains come into sync with each other. One of them was like all over the place, and the other one was rhythmic, and it was sort of watching them become, well, as you saw in that little visualization with the two heads coming together. It was, and so I'd had this phrase about when you read a child a story, you're giving them a hug that lasts forever. But it was literally happening at a synaptic level. You were literally building the machinery of happiness inside yourself, inside the child. And then we were talking about rhythm and predictability, and we're talking about how we've always known this, because that's how furry stories work. In the furry story, there are going to be 3 sons who go out to seek their fortune. The first one, he's mean, something really terrible happens to him. Second one is mean, something really terrible happens. But you're okay because you know, because you've heard hundreds of others, that the younger one's going to be nice and everything's going to be all right in the end. So that whole kind of up-down thing. We should go back and talk about Dear Zoo on a kind of, because we've got Dear Zoo in the mix. Something that you said that really struck me about Dear Zoo is that, well, I've got a sidebar about Dear Zoo, but I'll come back to that in a second. Do you all know Dear Zoo?
Yes.
So something you said that really struck me about Dear Zoo, in this terms of emotional reassurance, is that it's a book about frustration. Because the kid keeps asking for a pet, and they keep sending the wrong pet. What is wrong with these people? Why did they think an elephant would be a good idea? But it models that kind of, that rhythm of like, you can feel this and it will go away again.
I mean, what's really, really important about all of these books, so there's other things, so the other great books with babies are Yes from Jez Albrecht, that's about understanding kind of separation anxiety and then kind of frustration, no, and that type of stuff. And it's this, so they extract all of these, so that's one of the higher levels of meaning. So you will a baby will read Dear Zoo for hundreds of times before they get to that level of higher order meaning. So early on they'll be tracking, just their brains will just be simply learning to track on to the loud and soft. I wrote to the zoo to send you a pet. And so there's very, very sub-second levels, And then the next stage will be, they'll track the sentence structure. So you can see this. You can measure how brains track different levels of information and the thing. So then they'll track the sentence structure. I wrote to the zoo to send me a pet. They sent me a giraffe. So that's their level at which they're processing. And then this higher order level of, this is about kind of an emotional journey. That's the really, really higher order level. But you only get that. So literally, a baby would have read that hundreds of times before they're starting to get this higher order thing. And it's only through the repetition and the, learning how easily they track the fine-grained levels that you start to get to these higher levels of meaning.
There was a beautiful moment when we were both listening to Michael Rosen talking about where the wild things are. And there's so many gaps in where the wild things are. And at the end it says he wants to be where someone loved him best of all, but it doesn't say where that is. And he said he'd read it with his son like 50 times before his son said, "Mummy." And it was just like, oh yeah, of course, but that kind of leaning into it, creating the meaning.
Just one more thing before we go on. The other thing which we touched on briefly in the video that you mentioned about this doing the same rhythms at the same time.
Yes.
What's the phrase? A hug that lasts for. So this is an area where the neuroscience is honestly quite mysterious at the moment. So we really don't know why this is. And I spend most of my time sitting in conferences with neuroscientists, and we're like, why is this? We really find it really hard to explain. But there's something about experiencing the same rhythms at the same time as someone else, which has been shown in lots and lots of different studies to promote feelings of affiliation, so perspective taking. You find it easier to see something from someone else's point of view if you've experienced the same thing at the same time as someone else. Yeah? It's why we go to the theatre. It's why we go to sports events. It's why people are at Michael Rosen's Shakespeare thing earlier, getting everyone to repeat son's eyes, son's teeth, son's taste, son's everything. 1,200, 1,900 people repeating that. It's part of this learning that you do. But we just don't know why. So what is it about being in the same state at the same time, having these very fine-grained brain rhythms, as well as these more coarse-grained physiological rhythms? We don't know why this has a relationship. We don't have a mechanism yet for understanding why this affects our relationship, that we've been through the same pattern at the same time. How does information get between them? So it's a really interesting area.
It's so interesting. Yeah. So, and we were talking before about, certainly in Irish stories, there'll be passages in the story where you can tell that the audience is being asked to join in. I'm talking about long traditions of, so the story of Finn McCool, but we were talking about Finn McCool fighting with the giant, and they fought till the boulders were turned into rocks, and the rocks were turned into pebbles, and the pebbles were turned into dust. And this happens about 20 times in the story, and you feel that they're being invited to join in. So we've kind of always known this, that it works, but I'd like to talk a little bit about the fact that we seem to be unlearning it. There's less of that, and that's kind of what this campaign is for, that we're kind of losing that. So
yeah, you use this lovely phrase, the digital world is frictionless.
Yeah.
So you go, so a lot of this idea of rhythms is about kind of anticipation, yeah? So, as I'm going to get the book, yeah, and we're choosing a book with my kids, and they're getting into position with me on the bed, they're getting onto my, you're getting onto my lap, we always sit and read in exactly the same place. Their bodies and their brains are starting to prepare for what is about to happen, yeah? So we know what that is, and also the fact that we've done this at the same time every night in the same setting. So it's called allostasis. So our bodies aren't just reacting to change when it happens, they're preparing for change in anticipation based on their prior knowledge, yeah? And one of the things that's very different, this is Frank's phrase, which I really like, is in the digital world, it's just much easier to slip from one thing to another before you know it. Yeah? So my kids will be playing a game on an iPad and then they press the wrong button, and then suddenly they're in a different kind of app or they're on the home screen, and then they just go with it, they just improvise like that. But it's a very, very different way, and it's less good from my point of view. I don't like that because from our stress systems, this is what we do a lot of research on, yeah? Stress, the good type of stress is if I'm anticipating the strain of change, yeah? So I'm about to go on a run and my body is getting into fight or flight system and I'm about to go on the run as I'm putting on my trainers. And that's healthy stress when I'm learning to anticipate change before it happens, and then my body's ready for it, yeah? Whereas if I'm just, bam, something happened, now I've got to adjust, and then bam, something else happens, now I've got to adjust. There's a lot of evidence that exerts much more wear and tear, physiological wear and tear. You look at the telomeres, the chromosomal structures, the structures that house the chromosomal structures, and you can see that people who have kind of more predictable early life, they physically have more wear and tear on themselves.
it was really wonderful watching Ashley in your lab.
Yeah,
She's got 3 kids under 5.
Yeah.
And she was talking about her reading habits, and they're really rigid
in
a really good way. It was very kind of ritualized what she had.
Yeah.
And her kids were amazing. They're so good with each other.
Yeah.
And so from the point of view of this, one of the things that's really struck me going around the country is that one of the worst things about being in poverty or from an underprivileged background is the lack of predictability and the lack of rhythm.
Yeah.
And that this tool is really, really important. And this is why the big, as a children's writer, one of the big reversals that's happened is that in the tradition of English children's writing, school is horrible and you escape from it into the summer. Just William wants to get out of school. And that is just not true anymore. Kids like being in school because school is where it's predictable and manageable. School is where you're fed. So that whole thing that's just really, really kind of very, I keep stressing the word, but it's so fundamental, that ability to learn to manage rhythm and rhythm as a way of managing expectation. You kind of really opened my eyes to that.
Oh, good, There's a couple of things, so one of the things, so we do a lot of research on this, East London, where I'm based, has this massive melting pot of kids experiencing very, very diverse early life settings. And there's a lot of evidence that predictability isn't just about the school day, it's about how my caregiver is going to respond to me. So if I'm, a carer of a child with mental health issues, then I'm less predictable in how I respond to my child. So parents with depression, they're less likely to kind of vocalize in response or, do what a typical parent would do, which is if my child gets upset, I kind of parrot their emotion back to them. I kind of do a little upset face. back to them to show that I've understood how they feel and to go down like that. So there's a lot of evidence that just those moment-by-moment predictability, both of what I'm doing at the same time each day, and also how my caregiver is responding to me at a given moment, is kind of has a big difference. So that's why this kind of reading stuff is even more important for children who have that type of stuff. And the other thing, we're just doing a project at the moment looking at predictability in earlier settings as a way of kind of managing kind of emotion regulation. And one of my colleagues used this fantastic phrase of a vicious circle of unpredictability. So, if I'm doing well, doing circle time in the earliest classroom, and I'm sitting and I know what's going to happen and I do what is expected of me, and I understand what the teacher is saying, then everything is more predictable from my point of view. But if I'm the one who doesn't take part in circle time, who goes off and does kind of something else, then everything gets more unpredictable from there, because my teacher tries to ignore me, but then occasionally a teaching assistant will come over and try and talk to me, but I don't understand what's happening, and all of the routine goes. So it's really important, this idea of, my behaviours generate predictability, and I can get into this vicious circle, which is why reading is most important for those children who often experience it least.
And in terms of like predictability and rhythm, so many things are happening now that threaten that. So for instance, 0 hours means that is like making a virtue of your work day is completely unpredictable. But also, we talked a little bit. We talked a little bit before about watching kids' TV on YouTube. So I talked about this is a bugbear of mine. If anyone works for it, I'm really sorry, but there's a kid. The most watched TV, or the most watched thing for children in the world is Coco Melon. I don't know if people have come across Coco Melon, which is very pastel-y and seems benign, and I mean, kind of is benign in a way. It's very soothing. It's mostly nursery rhymes. There's nothing offensive or sharp about it, but its main viewing platform is YouTube, and the metric for success on YouTube is how long are you watching, right? So, and Coco Melon will happily, which I call cocaine melon, will happily bundle up episodes that are like 5 hours long, which you should not be sat in front of a screen for 5 hours if you're little. And I spoke to some people who worked on Coco Melon, and they are very, very discouraged from putting in the markers of rhythm. So there's never, ever a bedtime in an episode of Coco Melon, because that bedtime is such a signal for turning off, and we want you to frictionlessly lead into the next episode. Sorry, Julia.
Well, they do also time into... Coco Melon also leans very heavily into the repetition and the rhythm, because it is a constant repetition of tunes and rhymes and everything else. So they have been following your research, I think.
We have actually done a paper, so the rhythms of meaning, those are actually quite strong in Coco Melon. What you were talking about with the
I get that.
So there are ways, but they purposely try and get out these higher order, okay, it's bedtime now. I absolutely agree with you on that. Can I just say something quick on that?
Yes.
Okay, so one of the things, and again, this is the line that Frank said about Coco Melon having problems selling merchandise. So they have billions of views on their things, but the kids won't buy the merchandise. And I think there's some really interesting neuroscience on why. So a bit more kind of basic neuroscience. So there's 2 ways that our brains pay attention. Yeah, we talk about this a lot in the book, Take Action and Distraction. So there's 2 ways that our brains pay attention. One is when there's movement or something happening in my visual field. Yeah, I automatically have a warning signal go off, and I automatically pay attention to it. Yeah, even if I'm trying to pay attention to something else, it's very hard to ignore movement in the periphery of our visual field. Yeah, we've evolved like this because it used to be useful. Yeah, 10,000 years ago, our lives were very dangerous, and if I'm sitting outside my cave having my supper and there's a movement in my visual field, more likely than not, it's either something coming to eat me or something I can eat. Yeah? Nowadays, it's a real pain because advertisers exploit it mercilessly. So every time you go on a newspaper website now, there's all these moving adverts. Yeah? It's because it's hard to pay attention. Yeah? And Coco Melon targets that attention mechanism. Yeah? So they sit there, they have all these babies strapped into chairs, and the minute the baby look away, they put in a bit more movement, because there's always movement happening. Yeah? But there's a very different way of paying attention, which is how we pay attention when we read. Yeah? If you think when I'm looking at a book, there's nothing moving in my visual field. Yeah? Everything is static. Yeah? So every single eye movement, so you're moving your eye 3 times a second on average to take in the different words. Every single movement when you're reading is internally generated. It's not driven by stuff that's happening in the outside world. It's driven by me saying, I want to pay attention to that. Yeah? And this is a very different part of attention, which comes from this bit under here, the frontal cortex. It's basically the good type of attention. Yeah? It's the type of attention which is very much driven volitionally by what we want to pay attention to, and it's very much driven by kind of our understanding. So we find it much easier to understand things that we pay attention to. So I think the reason Cocomelon can't sell merchandise is because these kids are just strapped into it. Yeah? It's not a volitional choice to be sitting there watching it. Yeah? They keep their eyes focused on it because this pay attention to movement mechanism, which is very early developing, yeah, means that it's very hard for them to look away. Yeah? But they're not at all necessarily understanding what they're seeing. I spent a long time with my Rose, my daughter's now 4, but when she was 18 months, I was really fascinated by just watching her watch Cocomelon, and I could really imagine this feeling that she was trying to look away, but she couldn't, yeah? Wow. Which is why would they be interested in merchandise?
So you're hypnotized. So the opposite of that is this, one of the reasons that I've held on to wanting to do what we do is that I spoke to someone in Walton Jail who'd been in a reading group with the Reader Organisation, and they'd done Henry V. You have to fill in these assessments afterwards. And this guy, I shouldn't talk about what kind of person he was, but he was in Walton Jail for a reason. It's a very good reason. And why had you wanted to do Henry V? And he had really interesting things to say about Henry V, which is a play about turning your back on your friends. But why did you come to the reading group? He said this amazing thing. He said, that's the only time in my life. Because the way the reader works is that you just read. Yeah. No one's asking you for any feedback. Nobody's asking you to read unless you want to. Nobody's asking anything of you. It's just they're going to read to you. And if you interrupt, that's fine, but you don't have to. And he said, being in the reading group in Walton Jail was the only time I ever felt fully alert without being in danger. And what does fully alert mean? It means fully yourself, fully in control of where your brain's going.
Yeah. And I think there's some neuroscience to do on that too. So we're just starting out a project looking at this idea of screen media and fast-paced screen media and what's happening in our brain when, as I started with, our brains are prediction machines. So I'm trying to predict every millisecond what I'm going to see in here next. Yeah? And what's happening if I'm in a situation where stuff is coming at me too fast and I can't predict. Yeah? And again, it's a very old kind of mechanism that's been with us for a very long time, that if I'm in a situation where I don't know what's going to happen next, I go into this kind of high alert, high threat mode. Yeah? So this is another thing that is potentially really, really important for understanding young kids watching screens. And reading definitely has a very different form of attention. Yeah? This idea of calm, focused attention. Yeah? And it all comes from the fact that the actual information coming into your brain when you're reading is astonishingly little. Yeah? It's just a series of black shapes against a white pattern. Yeah? There's no movement, there's nothing. You're completely in control of what information is getting into your brain with each eye movement. Yeah? And then in a way that your brain understands, because it's all self-generated, you are then elaborating from this very impoverished stream of information that's coming in, yeah, the characters and the stuff that you're hearing and you're building on your imagination. Yeah? So this is a very involving thing for your brain to do, yeah, but it's very low perceptual processing, but very high cognitive processing. Yeah? And that's probably why you get this idea that this is reading promotes this very calm, very focused attention. Yeah? And it's very different to this, I'm having lots of stuff coming at me and I'm just trying to process.
Right. That's amazing.
Can I just...
I know.
I mean, there's just so much in this, but what's so interesting about it is that it's not how we've traditionally looked at the problems of reading.
No.
And you might like to think about that, Frank, and sort of move us into what do you see as other problems that may be causing what we are currently calling a crisis in reading for pleasure? I mean, we do now know something about the science, and that is completely fascinating. And I wondered what's interesting is a lot of the things you've said, children's authors actually were kind of automatically doing when they write books.
Yeah, they're kind of...
As if they knew it, but they didn't know it, no, probably.
Well, that's true culturally. I said, if you go back to
fairy
stories of Finn McCool, or you were saying before about in Homer, those refrains, we've kind of known this instinctively. I forgot what you asked, Julia, because this is like... whenever I'm talking to Sam, I feel like the baby in his first story where it's like, I was an aquatic creature. It was all really easy a minute ago.
Well,
now
just-
Sam's talking and
Well,
I need a
so,
nap.
yeah, what am I
But
that
you
the zoo
did-
sent you then? That's what I wanna
Before
know.
Sam was talking,
I mean,
you did know a lot about campaigning to try and, where you think the areas of problem may lie in children and reading in the UK
Sure,
at the moment.
because-
Because it isn't, I mean, I personally don't think there is a crisis in it because I see it from an angle of celebration like here, which, makes you think children love reading and do a lot of reading. But we do know that children are not reading as much as they were. And it's so multifaceted, we're not going to come up with any answers. But what do you think are some of the things you've talked about it, be it moving it away just from being about education?
Yeah, I
you
mean,
do
because
have a
of
view.
precisely what Sam said, that there's a very low input, so you're doing a lot of the work. Reading, therefore, has this huge status. And whenever we talk about reading as children's authors or as educationists or whatever, it's always in terms of the enormous cultural capital
Yeah.
of reading and the enormous educational advantage. I just instinctively, a while ago, I started to think about, well, but the emotional advantage is vastly more important than those things.
Yeah.
Not least because some of the things that we've been talking about, the world is changing so rapidly. We have no idea, we're educating our children. We have no idea what work is going to look like.
Yeah.
Why we're educating them in handwriting or anything like that. We have not a clue what skills are going to be required, what skills are going to be prestigious, what skills are going to be lucrative. Not a clue. Not a clue.
Yeah.
We don't really know what relationships are going to look like.
Yeah.
We do know that they need to be happy. And by happiness, I'm including resilient and flexible and nimble and open and all those things that come from happiness. They're key things. And as you get older, you realize that happiness isn't a mood. It's not a disposition. It's a set of life skills that find happiness. It's a discipline.
Yeah.
And that this, looking in that lab that day, I was thinking, these are the building blocks. These are the building blocks. And if we are withholding them from our children, or if we're ceding that human space to something that isn't human and that doesn't love us, what is going to happen? So for me, the crucial thing of this campaign is to move the dial away from education and away from culture towards health.
Because something I've kind of increasingly realising with my own kids at school is, for me and my wife, we always go on academics there because I loved academics. My wife loved academics at school. But for a lot of parents, a lot of people didn't have a good time themselves at school. And for that, when your kids start school, it's not what you want to be doing with them in the evening because it brings up dark and not unpleasant memories. Yeah? So going into reading, this will help your child's language scores at school. Immediately you get this thing about what I didn't do that, so why would I want that for my kids? But coming at it from a mental health point of view, coming at it from the point of view of, the world's changing very fast, but happiness is always going to be important. Two things that are essential for happiness are calmness, and perspective taking, relationships and being able to see things from other people's point of view. That's the single most important kind of mental health kind of predictor. Both of those things there's a really good evidence that are improved by reading, and both of those is a much more effective way to go in if you're trying to persuade people to read to their kids. What's going on?
I don't know, they're drilling to get in.
Can I bring us back to Dear Zoo?
Yes.
Because of what you just said. It's sort of a sidebar, but it's a really good example. We had a conference in Liverpool in January in which Sam spoke, and Michael and lots of people from different disciplines and backgrounds and social work and health and all kinds of things were in the room. And as it was leaving, I was watching people swap phone numbers, and a friend of mine was talking to you. He's a GP in Kirby, which is a huge estate it's a huge area outside Liverpool that's got a lot of all my cousins live there. It's a great place, but it is quite a difficult place. And I saw Michael talking to you, and I was thinking, oh, hello, And sure enough, I got a phone call about a week later saying, I've started a reading group for the young mums in my practice. And when we're talking about some of these mums are not, they were children themselves not very long ago. This is a situation that will square itself very, very, very rapidly. So he got me to come out to his practice and sit on the floor. And as we drove over, he said, there's something delicate about this because I bet some of them can't read. And some of them definitely won't be able to read English because they're new. They're new, that they've just arrived. But some of them will not be able to read, and a lot of them will have very negative experiences at school. So I don't know I don't know how to broach that. Everybody wants the best for their kids. Been there in about 5 minutes before one of them the group, the alpha female had said, I can't read. What are you going to do about that? And maybe 4 or 5 of them said that they couldn't read. Dear Zoo was just the biggest blessing because you just need to know one sentence, right? So I got Dear Zoo out and I said, look, you've got to know one sentence. I wrote to the zoo, send me a pet, and they sent me. You'll be able to figure out what it is.
Right.
You'll be able to figure out what noise it makes.
Yeah.
And I promise you, you'll make it last an hour. And they made me, and I did make Dear Zoo last for about 40 minutes with these young mums. And then I got a set of them for them. They made me sign Dear Zoo, which is like, I did not write this book. I did not write this book. I did not write this book. But it just took off instantly.
Yeah.
And so many other benefits flowed from that because a lot of them were quite isolated. Poverty is very, keeps you busy, keeps you away from
Absolutely.
other people. And that's sort of turning into a breakfast club. They're seeing each other, they're drawing strength from each other, they're finding that little space for them as young parents, as well as for the book. And it's sort of a joyous thing, it's not an unhappy thing, it's not a trial thing.
And it's not an expensive thing, that's your best
Yeah,
way.
it's 30 copies of which were given.
If you go back to that and you sort of think at the beginning of that, why did that not happen before in these young mums' lives? Why? What is so? What are the barriers to learning to read?
Yeah,
and I think
and
that
to
goes
read
back.
in a full sense.
Yeah,
like,
I mean, read for pleasure.
You can mechanically read.
Yeah.
But that's just, in a way, when people have been asking me that, I've been going, yeah, it doesn't matter why it happened, let's fix it. But they're under siege, aren't they, from all kinds of things, from their own busyness.
Yeah.
They feel inferior to the screens. So I'm watching at the school gates now, like a choreography of parenting that's changed, because before, when the baby cried, that you're taking the kid to school, the baby cried, even if you're just sticking a dummy in its mouth, you were bending down to stick the dummy in its mouth. Now I increasingly see people go there. Here's the, and it works.
Yeah.
And it's instant, and it's like, how are you going to compete with Netflix? They've got infinite money. Why would you be better? And I think we do need to remind people why your voice, whatever, is better.
It's going to be best.
Yeah.
This is another area where there's a bit of a gap in neuroscience at the moment, and hopefully this is something we're going to be looking at in this new project that we're just starting about this. If I get used to a lot of information coming at me, I crave it. Yeah? So and part of that is just, part of it is just our brains are prediction machines, and if I have we're wired to seek out this. By the time we get to adulthood, we're wired to seek out a certain level of unpredictability. Yeah? So it may be that some kind of deep-seated learning mechanism is getting confused. But there's definitely something about it. If I have a lot of information coming at me all the time, people on TikTok, you get a lot of that information coming. You definitely crave it, yeah. And if you crave it, then you naturally want to give it to your kids.
Yeah.
So that's a really interesting. I think about that a lot with my own kids.
Yeah.
Well, and you see that. I mean, why does everyone cross the road looking at a phone? I mean, they don't need that information at that moment, but it is.
No, they do need the information about where I'm coming at them in my car, though, which they're like, oh, we'll live without that. I need to know what Ariana Grande's doing.
Yeah. Let's just end with a sort of very, Frank, you've spent a lot of time on this, on thinking about how can we fix it. Give us 3 things that we could all do.
I mean, do you want to do one?
Yes, Sam can do one next.
I want to talk about nonsense. You know, talk about nonsense.
We didn't talk about nonsense. We
Sorry?
talked a little bit about nonsense and comedy.
Yes,
I want to
can.
talk about nonsense, and then
Because it's I think talk about it because it crystallizes something so beautifully in that it's the predictable, unpredictable.
Yeah,
So that you kind of like.
Michael Rosen was saying in this thing, that's the best way to start any play.
So like, I'm always watching comedians, and that choice, that precise choice of a word that's unexpected, but does make sort of sense. This stupid example that I get. I watched Alan Carr being interviewed, and he was talking about being pulled over for drunk driving, and he wasn't drunk. So he said this sentence, which you knew what that sentence was going to be, which was basically, officer, I've not been drinking, I've only had name the drink, glass of water. But he said, but I've only had a Rubicon. And it's just like, why is Rubicon so funny there? And it's like that brilliant thing. So in Alice, we were talking about, this was brilliant on the slide, that seems to make sense, but it doesn't. And that tiny shock of the predictable meeting the unpredictable.
Yeah, so there was just one more bit of, so part of that is just you get this mismatch, you know, just like
Yeah.
people laugh when I slip cabbage into that sentence.
Yeah.
It's just an unexpected thing. It has a little shock response. But this idea of just, you know, pure nonsense. So Frank's story sending me bits of pure nonsense, which is probably, but 'twas brillig and the slidey toes, the gyre and warble in the wade, you know, Lewis Carroll, Jabberwocky and things like that. Last bit of neuroscience on why that is, why this is such an interesting thing, I think. So I was thinking about this last night to talk about this. So this idea of how we first learn to take control. Yeah. So babies' brains are very passive. Yeah. They're very kind of just process stuff that's coming at them. I started off by saying, you know, we can't predict what's going to happen next. We just take stuff that's coming. Yeah. This old kind of idea, Gilbert Ryle, about Cartesian dualism, the ghost and the machine. So how does the ghost, that's my own kind of voluntary control, how does that learn to steer, you know, what I'm doing day by day? How does this develop over the course of the first few years of life? And one of the things that I think is really important is this idea that it's not that the ghost comes into a machine that's sitting there on the tarmac and turns the ignition and say, okay, now I'm in control of my behaviors. Yeah? And it's like when the ghost first wakes up, they're already driving this car that's been, you know, bouncing over these sand dunes. Yeah? And there's all this information that's coming at us from all of these different directions, all of these different rhythms. Yeah? And our brain is passively, reflexively processing this information. Yeah? And I'm just kind of, I learn to control what's happening just by kind of steering myself a little bit away just to get to the top of a sand dune. Yeah? So kids, for lots of reasons, are out of control of their behavior a lot of the time. Yeah? From, you know, their big, jumbled, over-connected brains can stick in a state of rhythmic firing for a while and then they collapse into some other kind of stuff. So they spend a lot of time out of control. Well, my kids certainly do, and spend a lot of time out of control of their behavior. And I spent ages with my son during lockdown, actually, with this. He was obsessed by, like, palakala, hafa, waka. We would just talk nonsense at each other for really, really long periods of time. Yeah? And I thought that was really good because it was capturing this, you know, chaos which is in him, this dysregulation, but capturing it with language. Yeah? And it was this first stage of I'm using language to try to exert kind of control, and I'm using language to try and extract meaning from my brain, which is kind of risking collapsing into all of the kind of this disorder. So that's one of the reasons I think, you know, I still love just really loud nonsense poetry because I'm quite a hyper person and I naturally collapse into things. So I love this idea of capturing chaos with kind of some type of kind of language.
Yeah, like tuning in. Yeah. You're asking me about what I'm going to do about it.
Yeah, sorry,
Yeah,
that was just
I mean, in the first
Yeah.
instance, the children that we need to be most concerned about are children who don't have got no chance of getting this at home.
Yeah.
So in terms of me talking to government, which I'm trying to do, first of all, some of those kids are already on government radar, so it becomes an important part. And I have to say, among the most harrowing visits I've made during this last, there have been a lot of harrowing visits, was finding out that there are kids in hospital with long-term illness who've basically been abandoned by their parents in the hospital because they feel, I can't do anything about it. I mean, again, they might be little more than kids themselves. And that doesn't trigger off a social work thing, so that they're literally just living in the interstices of these, you know, they're on drips and things, but they can't leave, but they're not, there's nobody in charge of them. So there are kids that in the system who should be on government radar who need this kind of thing. But also the driver of government policy is as regards children, is productivity. It's like getting as many kids into as much childcare as we possibly can to free people up to go to work.
Yeah.
So the least they can do is making sure that in those childcare settings, those workers are skilled up to make Dear Zoo last for an hour and a half, which is a really small ask. And, you know, in the broader context, I might not agree with everything about that policy, but in terms of, like, offering something in that context, I think that is a very small ask that will have a huge change.
And it's quite cheap.
Very, very cheap.
I think that's a wonderful solution. Sam, what would yours be?
I mean, I guess just that, obviously, a million times, but also just raising awareness about some of the stuff that isn't necessarily intuitive. You know, the idea of kind of, you know, kind of repetition being an important driver. You know, we do a lot of work working with kind of early years practitioners, and these kind of ideas, and, you know, the idea of all the stuff we've been talking about. You know, there isn't a lot of awareness about that, and it really does change your practice. Yeah, you're not constantly trying to stimulate a child. You're not constantly trying to do new things.
Yeah.
You're not constantly trying to teach them things. Your brains are young, early learning. I'm not going to go into more neuroscience and why, but early learning doesn't work with the, here's something and I'm trying to teach you. Early learning is about putting them in a situation where they can spot patterns for themselves. Yeah? So all of that stuff, there's just a lot of awareness raising. But I completely agree with Frank. If we're putting young children in childcare settings, which are a long way, not in a lot of ways ideal kind of learning settings for them, the very least we can be doing is upskilling the practitioners as best we can.
Yeah, share them a story.
Yeah.
I need a nap.
Thank you both very, very much indeed. I mean, that is quite kind of a lot to absorb, but a wonderfully simple solution. So I think we'll start with that. So there's now time for some questions. There's a mic. Is there a mic? You've got a mic? So if you want to ask a question, put your hand up and the mic will come along. Okay? Yeah.
This isn't really a question, but just to say, this report, which Julia held up, is readily available on the Book Trust website. And if you just go booktrust.org.uk, you will find the report will come up, and you'll see the amazing drawings by Chris Riddell all the way through, and it's totally brilliant.
He's really caught the hugeness of my biceps.
Yeah.
Like, one of my least appreciated, one of my least appreciated qualities. But
Shall we just take the two at the back and then the one here? Okay.
Would you say there are any themes or styles of children book writing that are not good for children's development, aside from obvious dangerous things? But
So there's some interesting research about kind of what we call salient. So I was talking about movement as something that automatically attracts our attention, and other things that automatically attract our attention are bright colours and edges. Yeah? And some children's books illustration is very, quite like Cocomelon in a way that it's very worried about the child not being able to sustain their own attention in a comprehension-driven way. So they try and cram as much salience as possible into the pictures. Yeah? And there's a colleague of mine, Anna Fisher, in the States, who's done some beautiful work that paring down the illustrations to focus on the meaning-containing content helps a child to understand it if you're tracking where their eyes are looking as they move around. So that's something about the visual design of children's books. I don't know about the language design. I mean, there's not all. I mean, so what we've been saying is good from a neuroscience point of view is this either da-dum-de-dum-de-dum-de-da rhyming couplets for very young readers, or this, there's a word, it's not an anacrostic where you have the same phrase that's repeated again and again. There was an old lady who swallowed a fly, I wonder why, where you get the same sequence of words being repeated again and again. Yeah. What's it called?
I don't know. It's just
I can't remember. There is a word for it. But those types of things are very kind of neuroscience informed as good things to do. Yeah? So I guess anything that just gives straight prose to very young readers. I'd say.
And I think the thing that I took away from listening to Michael Rosen and you talk was that thing about gaps. Where a kid has got to fill in some of the gaps themselves.
That's great.
That was very effective.
Yeah.
One here and then you.
Hi, I'm a secondary English teacher, and so I wondered whether you knew, as a neuroscientist, kind of at what point, is there a point at which things like the rhythm and the reading stop building that sense of calm and empathy? And I suppose also I was interested in whether the content of the book matters in terms of building those bonds with your younger children as well. So Frank was talking about frustration and empathy with the frustration of the boy in Dear Zoo. If it's just a book about, like, I don't know, counting beans or something, does it have the same impact? Was my question. And also, I think the term is anaphora.
Oh, yeah.
Where you repeat other stuff.
Is it? Oh, well done. Oh,
I knew her.
you. Anaphora, okay.
Anaphora.
That's two
She's
different...
my cousin. Yeah.
What?
Anaphora.
So the first one, so that's less my area, but there are various reasons why we understand from a neuroscience point of view why teenage brains find empathy harder. Yeah, that I'm not the right person to answer, but there are various reasons for that. But generally in terms of, concentration and the kind of problems, actually we didn't talk about this as much, but the kind of young brains find being in a noisy setting much more distracting, and they find it much harder to tune into one person talking in a setting where there's lots of kind of things happening at once. Again, for reasons we understand quite well. And that's quite slow developing. So there's research that even 12 to 13-year-old brains are much more distracted by being in a noisy setting. But I don't know, I would have thought the kind of calm, focused attention and empathy, that is definitely something that you build with practice.
Yeah.
You know, this is the thing. So I wouldn't have thought that would go down over time. You know, empathy for characters you read about in a book. You know, empathy for your parents maybe, but I think that's kind of, it gets a bit more complex. Yeah.
Question here.
Yeah.
Sorry.
There was a second question as well, Julia.
Oh, you want to finish the second
Well, I
one?
don't know if you
Sorry.
want to say on the second question. About the emotions, if you touched emotions.
Oh, I don't know.
I think we'll have this question here.
Oh,
Sorry, we'll move on just because we're going to run out of time. Yes, it's coming. It's coming. No, it's coming.
Thank you. Is that working? Hold it to my mouth. Firstly, thank you. Unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable. You talk about awareness and getting it out, and schools and practitioners, absolutely. How can we get something like that message, that first film that we saw, that clip, parent-friendly? So I work with parents now rather than school. You know, school's brilliant, reading for pleasure, teachers' reading groups, absolutely wonderful, and I agree. But you're talking here to the converted. So how can I, as well, can I have your clip? That's what I want to ask. And how can I use that? And can you get to parents and be those role models? Because, yes, it's raising awareness.
I mean,
how are we going to get out?
All change is a slog, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I've been talking a lot to health visitors and going to training schools for health visitors and going out with health visitors. So I think they are, in terms of like, I mean, the difficult thing is that really this works best in the home, right? And home life is a lot more fractured than it was. And there's that as a broader problem. And culturally, that's quite difficult to talk about. But we have an infrastructure that does get into the home, which is the health visitors, who are amazing. And I've got to say, we're talking about happiness. The happiest group of professionals in the world are health visitors. It's a really tough job, but they see results, and they never, ever retire. You've got to take them out and shoot them. No, I'm serious. Like, I see her, there's a health visitor that I see every morning. She's 76. She should have retired, and she went, oh, I couldn't. And when I've been to those settings, talking to health visitors in training settings, there's nearly always one, and you look at them and think, you're getting on a bit. And he went, oh, yeah, I used to have this massive job, but I've stepped down because health visiting was better. So they're a really happy bunch of people, and they get it completely, you know. So there is infrastructure there, and as I said, you know, if we can get to ministers to talk about if government is capturing a large cohort of children for reasons of productivity, they have a duty to listen to us about how to minimise the bad effect of that.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to stop it there because we've run out of time. Thank you so much to both of you, and that was so much to absorb, so much to think about, and I think to give us all actually a lot of hope to go away and think about how we can build on that in whatever bit of work we work in. I mean, you know, anybody who's contributing to how children engage with books and how that feeds into their lives, we can all do something worthwhile. So thank you all very much for coming, and thank you too. Thanks very much.